We put so much time and energy into running away from our pain, and we can't ever outrun it. I mean, ultimately, it will catch up to us.
Er is geen ontkomen aan. Ons brein wil verslaafd zijn. Eten, trippen, gamen, seks. Allemaal dingen die zorgen voor dopamine. Het stofje van verlangen. Als dat vrijkomt in onze hersenen, willen we het plezier herhalen. Meer zoenen, meer proeven, meer snuiven, meer scoren en winnen. Nog een klik, nog een hap, nog een kus. Inmiddels zijn we verworden tot behoeftige, genotzuchtige sensatiezoekers. En daarvoor betalen we een hoge prijs.
In order to lead fulfilling lives, we cannot relentlessly pursue pleasure, because the relentless pursuit of pleasure will ultimately lead to anhedonia, which is the inability to experience any pleasure at all.
Om de balans tussen pijn en plezier weer in evenwicht te krijgen, heeft hoogleraar Anna Lembke van de Amerikaanse Stanford University iets bedacht. Dopamine-vasten.
The longer we can go without using, the faster we'll get to that place where the craving really does start to go away. And this is a really important moment because it's the sense of, having some freedom from the substance or behavior. Dopamine has many different functions in the brain, but in a dedicated pathway called the reward pathway, dopamine functions as a signal to let us know that something in the environment is potentially important for our survival. And it does that by releasing dopamine in a specific part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. The more dopamine that is released in the nucleus accumbens and the faster that it's released, the more reinforcing is that substance or behavior. For example, in rats, chocolate increases dopamine firing 55% above baseline. Sex is 100%. Nicotine is 150%. Amphetamines are 1,000%. In rats, anyway, that maps pretty well onto rat behavior. A rat will press a lever for chocolate, but it can kind of give or take. Whereas a rat put in a cage with a lever to press for amphetamine will press that lever till exhaustion or death. Let me tell you about an experiment that attempts to distinguish between pleasure and motivation. Rats were bioengineered to not have dopamine receptors in the reward pathway. And what the scientists discovered is if they gave food to the rats, put it in the rat's mouth, the rat would eat the food and seem to get some gustatory pleasure from the food. But if they put the food even a body length away, the rat would starve to death. That's important because it tells us that dopamine is essential for motivation. That is the willingness to do the work to get the reward, more so even than the experience of pleasure itself. Dopamine is essential for identifying potential rewards in the environment. If you think about natural rewards, things like finding mates, food, clothing, shelter, if we didn't know where those were and how to find them, we wouldn't survive, especially, hundreds to thousands of years ago when we lived in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. So dopamine is the neurotransmitter that is the signal that tells us this is something that's potentially useful for survival. Go ahead and explore, approach, and potentially exploit. So one of the ways to understand what happens in our brains as we become addicted is to use an extended metaphor of the pleasure-pain balance. So imagine that in your brain, there's something like a balance or a teeter-totter in a kid's playground that represents how we process pleasure and pain. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way. Pain, it tips the other. So there are certain rules governing this balance, and the first and most important rule is that the balance wants to remain level with the ground. This is what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And the way our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. So for example, let's say when I eat chocolate, I like chocolate, so that releases dopamine in my brain's reward pathway, and my pleasure-pain balance tilts slightly to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than my brain adapts to that increased firing of dopamine by downregulating dopamine transmission, downregulating dopamine receptors, and this process is called neuroadaptation. And I like to imagine that as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until it's been tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That is the opponent process mechanism, often experienced as the come down or the hangover, or just that state of craving, wanting to have one more piece of chocolate. Now, if I resist that craving and don't have another piece of chocolate, the gremlins get the message that their job is done. They hop off the pain side of the balance and homeostasis is restored. But if I continue to consume my drug of choice over days to weeks to months to years, those gremlins start to multiply. They get bigger and stronger, and eventually they're camped out on the pain side of the balance. And now we've entered addicted brain. Now we need more of our drug in more potent forms, not to feel pleasure or get high, but just to level the balance and feel normal. And when we're not using, we're walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving.
We leven in een tijd van overweldigende overvloed. Met meer vrije tijd dan ooit, meer geld en meer spullen. En dan is alles wat we denken nodig te hebben ook nog eens one swipe away.
With the application of technology, we've been able to make old drugs more potent, more reinforcing, more ubiquitous, more accessible. And we've even invented drugs that didn't exist before, namely online digital drugs. So we've essentially taken all of these reinforcers, we've made them more accessible, more potent, more bountiful, more novel, more uncertain, because our brain is triggered by uncertain rewards more than it's triggered by reliable rewards. And the result is that we've created an ecosystem where we're constantly being encouraged to consume, to get high, to stimulate our dopamine reward pathway. We've taken behaviors that we typically think of as healthy, like exercise and reading, games, connecting with other people, and we've drugified those too. Overabundance itself is a stressor. People living in wealthy nations are now spending more and more time pleasuring themselves in all the ways that we can. And I believe as a result, they're actually changing their hedonic or joy set point and experiencing a physiologic response that resets their happiness threshold such that now rewards that would have made us euphoric a generation ago, barely ring the bell. Things that people would have experienced as sort of average amounts of pain generations ago now constitute intolerable pain. What's incredibly distressing for someone today was probably, like a paper cut for somebody, 2 or 3 generations ago. It's not just, it's like people are like lazy or they're, just not willing to do the work or what have you. I think it's really on some level of physiologic adjustment to this environment that we live in now, which is this environment of abundance.
A video from a parcel sorting center in China is going viral. Tons of packages cannot fit on the conveyor because millions of people around the world have ordered something for Christmas.
We are going to be decluttering some beauty stuff. I feel like I've held on to too much.
Only one country left until my husband and I visit every country in the world.
For the next 24 hours of my life, I have to be on this website at all times. It doesn't matter if I'm eating, going to the bathroom, or even sleeping. I must be on Omegle for all of those.
People usually start out using for one of two reasons, either to have fun or to solve a problem. That problem can be very wide-ranging, from trying to self-medicate anxiety or depression, or just stave off loneliness and boredom. If the drug or the behavior works for them, they're likely to return to using it again. Over time, however, the brain adapts to that stimulus such that we need more of our drug in more potent forms to get the same effect. In other words, our mind has now come to mistake our drug of choice as necessary for our survival. And eventually, in the end stages of addiction, the individual no longer experiences pleasure at all with their drug of choice. Now they're just using to stop feeling pain. So when I use the word pain, I'm really trying to encompass all forms of pain, physical pain, but also emotional pain. And we have so many ways to avoid physical and emotional pain in the world today, right? We have all of these distractions, all of these drugified behaviors and substances. For example, many teenagers tell me that they will pull out their smartphones in a social situation just to avoid the social awkwardness and social anxiety of being in a group. And I get that, but the problem is when we do that, we're not giving ourselves and our brains the opportunity to tolerate the social anxiety, which will ultimately allow us to overcome the social anxiety, right? One young person in my practice, a young man who was experiencing a lot of anxiety in middle school when he discovered social media and started posting videos of himself that got more and more views until ultimately he was getting tens of thousands of views. And what he described was this just incredible euphoria and validation and pleasure and reward that he got from the likes and the comments and the followers, such that eventually it took over his whole life. And he was not doing his schoolwork, he was not socializing or making friends in real life. He was just spending all of his time posting, reviewing comments, trying to get more followers. And in his own words, he actually got addicted to that process. And what he noted was that the more famous he got, the more anxious he got, right? And the more depressed and also filled with shame, which is very interesting because we really think about this mechanism for social validation as, why wouldn't that lead to more confidence? I mean, it wasn't until he essentially had a breakdown and then decided to go off of social media completely that he was sort of able to get himself back again. So shame and addiction to anything go hand in hand, because the truth is that if we didn't experience any shame at all about our addictive behaviors, we also probably wouldn't be motivated to change them. So some degree of shame is actually healthy and adaptive. It's probably the oldest emotion, but if it's too much shame, then it really inhibits recovery because then we're just continuing to use in order to escape the terrible feeling that shame is. We put so much time and energy into running away from our pain, and we can't ever outrun it. I mean, ultimately, it will catch up to us. So a better strategy is actually to stop and turn toward it and be curious about it. And notice that when we do that, we actually feel less pain. So it's mysterious and paradoxical. But when we stop trying to run from discomfort and we just recognize that it is an emotion, it will wash over us, it won't last forever, and beyond it is something better, we are much better equipped to find fulfillment in our lives. That's where we invite folks to do a dopamine fast. Again, dopamine is a metaphor here. We're not actually abstaining from dopamine. We're abstaining from the substances and behaviors that trigger dopamine in our reward pathway. And we commit to not using for 4 weeks. Why 4 weeks? Because that's on average the amount of time it takes to get past acute withdrawal and begin to reset those reward pathways. In other words, for those gremlins to hop off pain side of the balance and for a level balance to be restored. The key is you've got to get past those first 2 weeks. In those first 2 weeks, we're going to feel worse before we feel better because we essentially take our reward off the pleasure side of the balance. Those gremlins crash us to the side of pain and we experience acute withdrawal. But if we can just wait long enough, those gremlins will get the message. It's time to hop off. Homeostasis will begin to be restored. And we really will feel less depression, less anxiety, experience better sleep, and most importantly, less craving. The longer we can go without using, the faster we'll get to that place where the craving really does start to go away. And this is a really important moment because it's the sense of, having some freedom from the substance or behavior. So by, for example, committing to not going on a particular platform, maybe social media, for a period of time, we will find ourselves reflexively reaching for it. But if we can resist that, then we'll notice that the brain gradually starts to calm down, to quiet, and then we can really become observers of what our brains are doing and even have an original idea. At the end of the 4-week dopamine fast, when we realize, oh my goodness, this substance or behavior that I thought was, making my life better in myriad ways was actually making it worse, and I'm much better off not engaging in that substance or behavior. And that's a really powerful moment because it allows us to see true cause and effect. When we're chasing dopamine, we're not very good at seeing the true impact of our addictive, compulsive behaviors on our life. And this is where we make a pros and cons list after the dopamine fast. What was good about not using? What was bad about not using? Many people report many good things about giving up their drug of choice for a month, lessening of anxiety, lessening of depression, better sleep, but also just the ability to be more present for our lives, right? Just to be more awake, more present, to take stuff in, to give stuff back. It's a really wonderful gift, the gift of presence. And then the other thing that people talk about that makes the dopamine fast difficult is boredom, right? Like all of a sudden I've got all this time that I used to spend scrolling and swiping or drinking or smoking. And like now I'm not doing that and I kind of don't know what to do with myself. And that indeed is really hard. And boredom can be scary, not just because it's boring, but also because it really forces us to kind of ask some of these deeper existential questions like, why am I here? And what am I doing? And what do I care about? So you might look at boredom as an opportunity, right? An opportunity to ask some of those deeper questions, or an opportunity to kind of see what your mind comes up with when it's not constantly in a state of reactivity. And really, boredom is the midwife of creativity in many ways, right? Like when we're bored, that's when we allow ourselves to kind of come up with a new idea or a new thought. I do believe that addiction is the modern plague and that we will be dealing with the problem of the mismatch between our ancient wiring and our modern ecosystem of abundance for the next hundreds, if not thousands of years. But I'm also an optimist. I think that humans are amazingly adaptable and we're incredible problem solvers. And so I am optimistic that if we come together and really face this challenge, we will overcome it.